Our last lesson of the Middle Ages is going to be a lesson entitled The 100 Years War in Joan of Arc. And it's going to be a war that's going to take place from 337 to 1453 and will involve one of the great faces of world history, and that's Joan of Arc. Now, to get started, we have to do a little background research to see what was going on in England and in France during this time period. This is going to lead to the 100 Years War. Now, if you're looking at this diagram, you can see the diagram shows land that was held by France and by England and by Burgundy by 1430. Now, you can see England has its own territory to itself. But if you look at the borders of France, you can see that all three countries have territory in France. So in green, that's French territory in France. In pink is English territory in France. And the old Burgundians, the old invaders of Rome, came to the area and stayed and settled in an area called Burgundy. So if you're a French person living in 1430, you probably have a problem with the other two having territory within your border, especially England. Let's see how this plays out. Now, the 100 Years' War was a series of 9 battles that was only between England and France. It's a series of 9 battles between what grew into the two most powerful countries in Europe during this time of the High Middle Ages. Eventually, when you have two big powers like this, or as we say, two big bullies on the block, eventually they're going to have to go to fight, and they're going to fight. And that war is called the 100 Years' War. Now, the war starts because pretty much of the English trying to pick a fight with the French. Now, King Edward of England, because he held territory per the map that we just saw in France, was actually, according to the old feudal days, he was a vassal to the French king. So because the English king held land of the French king, he was actually a vassal. And King Edward of England didn't like the idea of being a vassal to anyone because forever kings were kings and they didn't have to answer to anyone. Well, coincidentally in France, the last member of a ruling family called the Capetians in France is going to die. Now, when a family that rules for hundreds of years in a country dies, there's a lot of questions that have to be answered. Number one, who's going to take his place? Who's going to rule next? Is there a ruling family that will pop up? Well, the French chose King Philip VI to rule France after the last member of this ruling family of France died. Well, Edward of England looks at this as an opportunity and sees France is somewhat in disarray politically because they really are unsure about a king. So Edward from England pops off to the French and says, you know what? I'm the king of England. I have land in France, and you know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to put myself on the throne of France and call myself the King of England and also the King of France. Well, if you're a French person living in this day, you can imagine that they weren't real happy about this English King Edward claiming that he was also the French king. What are they going to do about it? Well, let's go to war. Now, this 100 Years' War was a new kind of war in our world because there were new advancements in technology in warfare. Now, the English possessed something called a longbow. And during this war, the English had possession of pretty much all of the castles in northern France. So they always had an advantage from the start because they had the high ground. They had the castles. And imagine these English longbowmen with these bows that were about 6 feet tall, that shot an arrow that was about 3 feet, and they could shoot it 150 to 200 yards, all right? And they were deadly, deadly archers. Now, the French had cannons. The French had gunpowder, and the French had a crossbow, that trigger mechanism weapon that they would use. Well, the French, if you recall, brought these things back from the Crusades. And early on, because the French had a hard time moving cannons from place to place, the English had a huge advantage. Now, the English could fire a lot of those longbow arrows a lot quicker than the French could. The French would have to be very close to fire a crossbow. They would have to get real close to the castle walls, and it took them a long time to reload. Now, which meant the English longbowmen had the advantage. Now, the French really wanted and enjoyed capturing the longbowmen, because what they would do is they would cut some fingers off. They would cut fingers off of the English longbowmen, which would disallow for them to shoot arrows ever again. Now, it was said after a battle that when the English had won this battle, on the tops of the castle walls, they were shooting finger gestures at the French below, basically telling the French, you didn't capture us, and we still have our fingers. Well, those finger gestures actually evolved into a finger gesture that is not exactly very appropriate, that maybe your parents bring out in the car driving around town sometimes. We'll leave it at that. Now, it's a new kind of war because castles were no longer needed, nor were they effective. You could take a cannon, point it at a castle wall, and blow a hole in it, okay? Now, siege tactics, which means trying to get into a castle, improved as well, because the Muslims are going to show the medieval crusaders all kinds of new siege tactics of how to get into a castle wall. Well, let's get into the war. Now, take a screenshot of this, and you can add it to your notes, because I kind of want to introduce this, and I want to tell you how this all worked out, and I actually want to ruin the surprise of who's going to win the war if you know about how battles are won and lost. Okay, so here's the battles of the 100 Years' War, and here they're actually names, and you can see the years. Now, if you are observing this slide, you will say that this was a lopsided war from the start, because the English, in every battle that they fought in the 100 Years' War, from 1340 to 1424, almost 100 years, are going to win every single battle. And it's because they had the high castles, they had the high ground, they had the advantage inside the castles in northern France, and they had the English longbows. Now, you will see, however, that the French are going to have their first breakthrough in 1429 at the Battle of Orleans, and then finally in 1453 at the Battle of Castillon, which is the last battle of the 100 Years' War. So I want you to stop for a second and make a couple deductions and observations about the battles that were fought, the years that they were fought, and right now, go ahead and ask yourself, who won the war? Now, let's move on. So let's go ahead, and before we actually finish up the war and get into it a little bit more, we have to stop and talk about this famous person in world history, and her name was Joan of Arc. Now, Joan of Arc was a French girl, and she lived in a very rural village, a farming village, outside south of Paris. Now, she was a 16-year-old when she jumped on the scene in the world, and basically is going to play a major role in the 100 Years' War. Now, when she was a little girl, it was known that the parish priest knew that she always talked about hearing voices in her head. And those voices, when she was a young girl, came from three of her patron saints, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret. Now, when she was a young girl, those voices would tell her to be a good girl, clean up after yourself, help your parents, do your chores, and all kinds of stuff like that. Well, as she got older into her teens, she claims that these voices got a little bit more intense in what they were telling her to do. When she was 16 years old, she told her priest, her local parish priest, who she had a very good relationship with because she was very religious. She told the priest that her voices told her to leave her village, to go and talk to the new king at Chinon, tell him that she is going to be the person responsible for winning the 100 Years' War for the French against the English. She was going to go to the king and ask him to go on and permission to go to Orleans, the city that was under siege, that the English by this time had already won every single battle in the 100 Years' War. And that's just what she does. She leaves her village, she goes to the king, she convinces him that she could be the one that leads France to victory in the 100 Years' War and allows her passage to go to the city of Orleans. Well, when she got to the city of Orleans, she ran into an army of French soldiers, hardened, experienced French soldiers, that had been fighting this war for a long time now. Generals that, were a little bit unsure of a 16-year-old teenage girl saying that she is going to be the one to save the city. Well, she convinced them as well, and it was said that she, many times, rallied the troops around the city, led them into battle on her horse. It was said many times, the legend and the story goes that she was pierced by an arrow. She fell off of her horse. She actually took the arrow out of her body and continued to fight, which many of the French soldiers saw as a sign that she was the one. She rallies the troops at Orleans and saves the city, giving the French their first victory in the 100 Years' War. Now, there's all kinds of images, there's all kinds of paintings of Joan of Arc, all right? And there's the famous sight of her on a horse and how she was waving the flag and rallying the troops and was pretty much responsible for the French winning their first battle in the 100 Years' War at the famous city and battle of Orleans. Now, you can imagine that the English got tired of hearing about her, and there was a huge bounty placed on her head after the Battle of Orleans. In fact, Joan of Arc was captured. She was captured by the Burgundians. And the Burgundians, if you recall, during the Roman Empire, when we did our lessons on the invaders of Rome, they were actually friends with the Romans from the start, and then they turned their backs on the Romans when the Romans were falling. Well, guess what they did? They were allies with the French early. They captured Joan of Arc and turned her over to the English in 1430. Now, at that point, Joan of Arc was put on trial. And she wasn't put on trial for what she was doing during the war. She was put on trial for heresy. Heresy means being a witch. A heretic is a witch. Because if you openly told people that you were hearing voices in your head back in those days, that was considered heresy. It was considered witchcraft. So she was actually put on trial by the British and grilled and grilled and grilled with questions. Imagine this young girl placed in a room, in a chair, with hundreds and hundreds of church clergy people, bishops, priests, all around, putting her on trial. Basically, the questions that they were asking her was all about the voices in her head. And the bishop that she knew and was friends with was actually the person that was put on trial, or was actually asking all these questions. So after days and days and days, she would not repent. She would not say that I do not hear voices in my head. The bishop sat her down one more time and said, Joan, if you do not repent, if you do not take back that you are not hearing voices in your head, you're going to die. You're going to die, okay? So on the very last day of the trial, he asked her a couple questions. And the first one was, when was the last time, how often do you hear your voices? And she goes, all the time. He goes to her, when was the last time that you heard them? She goes, they're talking to me right now. He goes, what are they saying? She goes, the English are going to lose a horrible, horrible war in the 100 Years' War, and they will eventually lose all of their land in France forever. And the bishop says, guilty. She would not repent. So they literally took her outside immediately from this makeshift courtroom, and waiting for her was a stake. Now, back in those days, when you were convicted of being a witch or you were convicted of heresy, you were literally burned at the stake. And in 1431, very famously, Joan of Arc was burned at the stake because she would not take back the fact that she heard voices speaking to her, basically, in her head. Now, here's your Catholic Church in action. So she was burned at the stake in 1431. And there's all kinds of famous pictures and images and paintings that depict this very horrific scene in world history. The Catholic Church in 1456 kind of walked back their guilty verdict of Joan of Arc and said, oops, we think we made a mistake. She was innocent. Well, as you can see, she had already been dead for 25 years, okay? So that was a little embarrassing for the Catholic Church. Now, it took them even that much longer to pronounce Joan a saint. And in 1909, Joan of Arc, by the Catholic Church, was considered to be a saint. And that is the namesake of a school in Boca Raton, Saint Joan of Arc. And that's where that comes from. Now, so one of the most lasting achievements of Joan of Arc was this idea of patriotism, this idea of love of your country in France. And it stirred up this patriotic feeling where pretty much the French were not going to lose another battle in the 100 Years' War. So they go on and they win the Battle of Castillon. As Joan talked about, we'll talk about the effects of it and what happened to England. Now, a couple more effects of the 100 Years' War is this, all right? So national governments grew stronger. So people that were English became more patriotic within their country, and so did the French, all right? So these national governments grew stronger. Now, the lawmaking body of England had been created by now, which we'll look at, and you probably did in your outline already, called Parliament, okay? So the lawmaking body of Parliament, which was then and is still to this day, is going to grow stronger. France's equivalent of England's Parliament is what they call the Estates General. That grew stronger in their decision-making and so on with the support of the people. Now, England is eventually going to lose all of its lands in France. All right, so that was one major cause of the 100 Years' War, England simply having land in France eventually, and Joan was right, the English are eventually going to lose all of their land in France forever till this day. Now, warfare, the type of fighting that took place on these medieval battlefields during the 100 Years' War during the High Middle Ages is going to change warfare forever in Europe. You know, armies in the past, in the early Middle Ages, were fought by vassals, fought by farmers with pitchforks, fought by vassals that didn't have armor, and so on, okay? Well, now, and as a result of the 100 Years' War and the new technology in warfare, kings are going to need soldiers, professional soldiers, and armies to fight moving forward in the future, not vassals and definitely not peasants armed with pitchforks. And all of medieval Europe's governments saw this and are going to have to make that adjustment. Now, last thing we got to talk about is the land. All right, so by 1453, the English were driven out of France. And except up in the top right-hand corner or the top of the map, you can see a little port city called Calais. We'll actually revisit the city of Calais during World War II, for those of you that still have me in May. The English were allowed to hold on to that city because it is very close to the English border there, and it was a huge trading city for the English. All right, so the English were driven all the way out of France as a result of the 100 Years' War, except for this little city of Calais. However, Calais was lost about 100 years later. So by the late 1400s, the Renaissance had already started. The English had lost all of its lands in France. And that's our story on the 100 Years' War.